Hi Tony, how are you?
I'm fine, Chris. Thanks. How are you?
Good, thank you. Really, really good. Thanks for joining us on Cervello Live. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
And just as a starting point, and we'll talk a lot about investor and customers throughout the interview. But tell us a little bit about you.
Okay, so I'm very family orientated, even more so now that my two daughters are back from university and living at home, or as they might put it, trapped at home in the current circumstances. I'm also a sports fanatic, although sadly that's more about watching than playing these days. With my business background, I started in marketing. I did a business studies degree, thinking I was going to become an accountant, but got very interested in marketing and worked for a couple of companies. Spent a long time at a company called Video Arts, who were best known as doing the John Cleese training films.
Oh, right, okay.
Great amount of fun because you never knew who you were going to bump into in reception at any given time. And from there, I set up my own business consultancy and then worked a little bit with Business Link in the east of England, advising small businesses, and then joined Investor in Customers in 2011 and became MD in 2015.
Amazing stuff. And what's it like for the girls being back at home now? Sort of leaving university, thinking they're going to sort of find their own way and get an independence, and then suddenly find themselves at home again?
It's a challenge. My eldest daughter actually was in India at the start of lockdown. She works at KPMG, and she was out there on a project. She came back at the end of June. Found it quite difficult. Joined a new team at KPMG, who she's met, I think, just under half of them at the moment, because she's not into the office. She can go in very occasionally, but it's not really encouraged to go into the office. So she's finding it difficult to sort of join up with a new team and integrate with them remotely. My younger daughter finished a university at the Central School of Speech and Drama, and she's now working for a charity in Onga, working with disabled adults in terms of helping them with their drama, but also in terms of life skills, using drama as a medium of education. That's challenging because she has to go in, she can't do that remotely. So again, you've got all the areas there, and in the teaching school environment, which is effectively what it is, they've got their own challenges in terms of the rules and everything that they've got to undertake. But no, it's a challenge. I'm just grateful they're old enough not to have involved me in homeschooling over the last
Well, that's certainly something that I've been failing at drastically over the past few months. I mean, Cass is on the other side of the desk, and she said, "What homeschooling did you actually do?" And the reason I did probably less than I should have done is because I'm definitely not made to be a teacher. I mean, it got to a point where in one of the early days when we started doing Cervello Live during lockdown, we had the Financial Education Teacher of the Year on as a guest. And the reason that I wanted to interview her is purely and simply so she could teach me how to homeschool well. And it helped a little bit, and Helen was amazing. But I definitely think I didn't miss my vocation. But one thing...
I'm a school governor at my local secondary school and a trustee of the Chelmsford Learning Partnership.
Okay.
So I do think a lot about giving back to the local community. Means quite a lot to me.
Yeah.
And I've got tremendous admiration for the work they've been doing in such difficult times. I think
100%. Yeah.
Sometimes it goes underreported and understated.
100%. And one of the things that I want to talk about is helping clients and customers in the new world where we're using technology a lot more. And I know that certainly as you know, Tony, my two girls are 16 and 8, and the platforms like Google Classroom and Teams and they've been using to learn. There's just the dynamics completely changed, and we've all had to adapt to that new reality, haven't we?
But we have. There's a lot talked many years ago, back in the first days of the internet and things becoming digital, about the concept of digital natives and digital immigrants, and the digital natives being people like me who sort of had to or sort of people like my daughters who had grown up with this technology, and the digital immigrants being people like me who sort of had to adapt as we go along. And I think it's becoming a bit of a divide in some of the organisations we talk to. I think particularly those based in the cities don't have any intentions of going back into London or Birmingham or Manchester. anytime soon, and they're relying much more heavily on digital communication, and I think that's a little bit of an uneven playing field for both customers and staff in terms of some that have really adapted to it and some that struggle.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really interesting point, because you're going to have, particularly with some of our older clients, you're going to have part of the work that we're trying to do is make sure that they're comfortable with some of these new platforms we're using to communicate, because it's not always about having the best technology. It's about making sure that it's easy to use for your clients, isn't it? And I think there will be a gap there, right?
It is. I think that there's two things on that really. I think one is it has brought forward the pace of change quite dramatically, particularly in the IFA sector, which we work with quite a lot, where it's moving away from the home visit to doing more things technologically. But also in areas like the NHS, they've been trying to introduce some of the technology changes in the NHS for quite a long time, and it's been quite resistant, whereas now doctors are becoming more familiar with doing online consultations, telephone consultations, which actually should be a good thing, because that will speed up the process and hopefully make things smoother going forward. But I do think it's a challenge, and I think one of the areas that people are struggling with, particularly with the older generation. So I'll give an example with my mum who's in her 90s. Most of the relationships she's got with firms are through me, through my email address.
Yeah.
Now some of the companies that she deals with, I also deal with, and there's a challenge there in terms of often having the same email address for two people and having two different accounts can be a challenge for a lot of organisations, and sometimes they just can't cope with it. So I've got an interesting scenario with a couple of the utilities that I look after for my mum and for us, that I have to use one through my home address and one through my work address, because their systems are too inflexible to actually have me manage both through one account. Yeah,
and it's typically the larger firms that struggle with that, right? Because they've invested in technology, and it's interesting. One thing before we actually start sort of talking about investor and customers, you mentioned that you like sport, but you're not a particular player. And I've seen you on the pitch, Tony. I think to say your Premiership quality is probably a step too far, but like don't hide your light under a bushel, mate.
No. One of the highlights of my sporting career, in glorious as it is, was playing at Upton Park when they just before they moved to the stadium. So that was really good.
Yeah, that was good fun. That was an opportunity that neither you or I could resist. Right, you've got to just do that once in your life.
Absolutely, coming out with the bubbles going and the sound and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it was good. It was great fun. So talk to me a little bit. Tell me about your background. Talk to me a little bit about what Investor in Customers does and who it helps.
Okay, so Investor in Customers, or IIC for short, has been going for almost 15 years now. It started in 2006, and it started as a business running customer surveys. Okay. And it's evolved into a customer experience agency, helping firms to understand the needs of their customers and also their employees, and really detailing the actions that they need to take, not just to meet those needs, but to exceed them, and in doing so delight their customers and their employees and engendering their loyalty. Yeah. We surveyed more than 3 million people and worked with over 300 different organisations, not just providing them with actionable insight about how to grow, but also presenting them with an IIC award, a gold, silver, or bronze standard to show their customer centricity. We work with a lot of financial services firms. Our founders were from that background, and in fact one of them, John Moray, who was very instrumental in the introduction of SIPs into the UK when he was one of the senior team at Suffolk Life, is still our chairman. But we work across a number of different sectors and companies of all sizes. So large organisations we work with will include the likes of AXA and Pilkington, but we also work with smaller companies and also with some startups who really want to set a benchmark for understanding what their customers' employees think now, so they can then sort of develop those services and products over time.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I know that you sort of focus on clients, but help me understand a little bit about the employee side. So I suppose understanding where employees are in terms of how they feel about the firm they work for is a fundamental part of the puzzle, isn't it?
It is. I think where we differ from a lot of organisations organisations is we don't just look at customers, and we look at what's the gap between the internal and the external perspective. So we look in terms of the work we do and the customer assessments. We have a separate questionnaire for senior managers, a separate one for employees, and another one for customers. Plus, we also look at our own external perspective, so you get the 360-degree view. And it's very much around the customer experience. It's what do the senior team think the organisation should be doing in respect to their customers? What do the employees think they are actually doing? And is there a gap between what the senior team wants and the customer or the employees think they're doing? And often that can be quite marked, particularly in some large organisations which can become very silo-based. But then the key area as well is looking at the perspective between what's happening on the inside and the outside. So is what the employees think they're doing the same as what the customers actually think they're receiving? And again, there can be significant gaps around there.
Yeah,
a lot of that is driven around empowerment, really. One of the areas we look at within organisations, and we feedback a lot, is quite often the frustrations or some of the negativity coming from customers can be replicated or reflected by what the employees say. And that becomes a key thing in terms of what's stopping those employees doing something about it. So is that attitude in terms of they could be doing something about it but they choose not to? Yeah. Or is it empowerment where they actually don't have the skills? I don't think they're going to be backed up by their bosses if they do something. And we talk a lot about getting things right first time and people in the right place doing the right thing at the right time. Yeah. And it's really about that, getting rid of some of those attitudes, particularly in some of the regulated firms where they can be hiding behind some of the areas, and particularly other companies hide behind GDPR or even health and safety, strangely enough, where we can't do that because, and actually they could do that, but they choose not to for whatever reason. Yeah,
it's an interesting one. I mean, I've worked for large firms, and it was funny. Like in a couple of large firms, I worked with did this really well. But in a couple of large firms, I remember walking in and seeing and we're going to be talking about values a little bit later on, but they had their values on the wall. It was a bit of a running joke in the office that in quite a large team of people, the values that the senior management used to talk about wasn't always aligned with what we did day to day. And I think there's sometimes a disconnect between what the values of the business is, and I think it's more difficult to align everybody to those values as the business grows. And it's weird, when we launched Cervello, or it used to be called Principal, but now Cervello, sort of over 10 years ago now, I was quite cynical about values because of the experience that I had with big corporates. And I'd imagine that if they would have just done a bit more work saying, this is the direction of the business, what are the disconnects between customers, clients, employees and senior management, it might have had a better sort of route to success for that particular business. What do you think?
No, I quite agree. Actually, I love it when companies have got their values on their website or publish their values, because it gives us a bit of an open goal in terms of reflecting what their employees are.
And they actually live in it, right? Are they, like, if I walked in, would the employees even know?
Well, that's very true, and I think that's equally important now. And I think one of the key things around there is that one of the problems I see with values is they get set in stone many years ago, and occasionally get looked at and dusted down, and they might use a little bit of change in terminology. So we might now talk about clients rather than customers or whatever, but actually they probably haven't changed, and the world has changed in the last 6 or 9 months. So are people now actually looking at what their customers, what their employees now need, and what those values should be to reflect those needs? Yeah, and it's just simply, this is what we did years ago, and the same applies now.
Yeah, and it could be that the leadership's changed and actually the values of the business are different, right? And if it's dusted down from 20 years ago, that might not apply. Now, I know that you talk about the sort of 4 main principles of customer-client experience. Talk to me a bit about them and how you see that operating within a business.
Okay, so within the methodology we use, as you say, there's 4 principles. So the first one is understanding customers. And that's not just about having their name or their history on a CRM system. It's about really understanding and actually knowing what it is they want from you. and then also being able to anticipate their needs. So quite often customers don't know what they don't know, so therefore they're looking for help, they're looking for guidance. But a lot of organisations just fall into the trap of taking what they want at face value, or thinking that because that's what they had last time, that's what they want next time, and not really getting to understand what it is that they require. The next one is meeting customer needs, and that's, again, this is surprisingly, we find quite a few organisations will score higher for meeting customer needs than they do for understanding customers.
Okay.
That's around the whole concept of, we've got a mass product or service that meets the general needs of our customers, but we're not personalising it. We're not taking it down to that individual level and really finding out what's right for each customer's. And having a little bit of a sort of one-size-fits-all scenario across different customers. And one of the areas we do look at is a lot of segmentation in terms of different customer groups or customer personas, really helping them to break that down so it can be consistent across the whole organisation and for different types of customers. The third principle is around delighting customers, and very much that satisfying customers isn't really enough any longer. You've really got to go and delighting them. And I think that's one of the key areas that, to me, is the big difference between customer service and customer experience. But customer service looks at just satisfying a customer on a here and now transaction, whereas customer experience looks at the whole process. So what happens when they first engage with you, how they treated, what lasting impressions have they got, through to when they make their first purchase, how that can be used, how that can be followed up. Is there ongoing support, or is it seen as a one-off? So that delighting customers is looking much broader than just the one-off here and now transaction, to that whole experience from, as I say, from the onboarding all the way through to the what support do they get post-sale.
Yeah.
And then we look at engender loyalty, and we use Net Promoter, which is as everyone will no doubt have had it many
NPS,
times.
yeah.
How likely are you to recommend this company to a friend or relative? And again, for employees, we look at the same, which is how likely are you to recommend this company is a good place to work. But we also look at the other metrics, our own metrics around loyalty, and very much around that is looking at the difference between retention and loyalty. So I think a lot of people fall into the trap of just believing that because they've got customers who've been there for a long time, they're incredibly loyal. Yeah. Actually, sometimes they're staying there despite what you do, rather than because of it.
Yeah. I think there's also an element of, and I know that here at Cervello we've probably been guilty at certain points falling into this, just that element of complacency. We must be doing something right if 99% of our clients never leave. And I think over the longer term that's a very, very dangerous attitude to take, isn't it?
It is, because I think it's never been easier to switch, actually. In some cases, some companies actually always encourage you to switch. I'm thinking of insurance companies who are offering sort of cheaper deals for new customers than they do for existing ones. But even some of the things that have made it difficult, some of the financial services in particular, sort of banks, but also some of the utilities, and now it is easier to move, and the regulators are very keen on making sure it's easy for people to switch. So you don't have that sort of locked-in customers anymore. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Some of the banks now we're in the process of changing who the business banks with, and there's a switch scheme that allows people to switch really easily. Trying to get a new bank account open and everything switched, however, is a bit of a challenge. So it's interesting how those barriers pop up in different places. One of the things you mentioned, and again, this wasn't a question that I prepared for, but I'm interested. In my head, understanding clients or customers would be more widespread typically than step 2, which is meeting customer needs. So I'm surprised that actually there's a lot more customers who find, look, you're meeting my needs, but you don't understand me properly. What do you do when you've got a firm like that? And what actions can they take to make sure that they're doing more work to really properly understand what a client wants?
A lot of that is around the segmentation, so it's looking at the different customer groups.
Yeah.
And that could be demographically, that could be regionally, it could be which office they're coming from or working with. And I think the key area around that is what is it that's right for me, and those needs could change over time. My individual needs, today might not be the same as they are next time. If you think about it, a restaurant, for example, they might have a restaurant that I go to a lot. But if I go for a business meal, I might need a different type of service to I would need if I was going out for a meeting with family. Going out for a meal with friends, that could be slightly different. From a financial services point of view, the financial advice I need for my business is different to the financial advice I need from my IFA. Now, I'm lucky to have a good IFA. I'm also lucky.
He's all right, isn't he? He's all right, your IFA. I've heard he's pretty good.
Yeah, no, he's excellent. But looks after the whole family. But again, if I talk about my accountant, Clive Myers, who I know you know, he looked after my personal sort of tax returns, but also is our business accountant, and also actually is the accountant I use at the cricket club, where I've just retired from being president. And when I was treasurer there for a number of years, Clive was very helpful, and he understood, even though he's talking to me each time, I had different needs in each of those occasions. So what I needed from the cricket club was advice around a lot around VAT and some of the regulations around there. From a personal point of view, it's around pretty much just doing the tax returns. But from a business point of view, he's almost our sort of interim finance director, because he's very good at not just doing the day-to-day accounts, but actually providing advice and helping us.
Yeah, well, it's that sort of just being able to take off and put on those different hats depending on what situation that particular individual or business is in, isn't it? Just having that adaptability.
It is, yeah. And again, it's very much that sort of horses for courses expression.
Yeah.
But, as I say, it's really being sort of perceptive and attuned to the needs of customers, rather than just saying, well, I've got this product or service, I'm sure that must be what you want.
Yeah, and I imagine that, like, sort of for a quite bespoke service like ours or like Clive's, it's probably a little bit easier to adapt. Do you find, in your experience, the bigger financial services companies sometimes struggle with that sort of bespoke sort of service just because of the nature of who they are and what they do?
It does, definitely, and sometimes that can be regionally based. It's a little bit of a myth, but there is a sort of view that if your company is based in London, then the further the offices are from London, the less they're respected or treated. I do think there is quite a strong north-south divide in terms of attitudes for customers, but also in terms of attitudes of how people actually engage with each other. But I think, again, it comes back to that not trying to impose a system across the whole organisation. And I remember one insurance company that we still work with, although like a lot of these companies, they're consolidating, so some of our customers keep taking over other customers. A little bit annoying, but one of these companies, I was talking to the manager of the office that's based in Penrith, and they were saying it's crazy because they put these sort of company-wide views on that a salesperson or one of their account executives has to go and see a minimum of 5 customers a day. And as you quite rightly said, the ones based in London could see 5 customers probably within their lunch hour because they're all in the same place. They can certainly see them very easily and probably just walk between them, whereas some of their customers are at 50, 60-mile drives. Trying to see 5 of those in a day is logistically a challenge. So,
well, I suppose since COVID, the playing field's levelled a bit, right? Because you're sort of doing Zoom meetings. It's really interesting. I've been having this conversation with a few people over the last couple of weeks, and again, each organisations have different perspectives on this. But we had a conversation about whether, and again, it depends on the business, whether a deeper relationship is better than more relationships. And I think my perception over time is, having deeper relationships with smaller numbers of people is probably better than just trying to overextend and just have superficial relationships with more. What do you think about that? And how does that relate to what clients experience?
I think it depends on the business. I think for your business and our business, that's right. whilst we always want to look for new customers, actually having the time to devote to those customers and to really do the job properly takes time and takes effort and takes investment. And I think that's the key for a lot of businesses. I mean, there are certain businesses which are much more sort of a numbers game.
Yep.
The more they get, the more footfall or more throughput they get is fine. But I think it's if I look at the IFA market, it's really understanding some of those areas. And there could be some quick wins or some times where it needs to be sort of much more of a scattergun approach.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of things like auto enrolment for the companies who are dealing with some of the smaller firms who had a need, and that was actually driven by getting as many people through that particular process.
That was a time window where everybody had to comply, and actually we had to adapt to that a bit as well.
Yeah. But it's then what's happened with those organisations going forward. So a lot of those customers and some of the areas we look at with the people around the pension side, they're not really, they've got the pension, they've got it in place, but in some cases we do some of the work with both the administrators and the organisations that run those pension schemes, and sometimes the customer or the member view is, well, you chose me, I didn't choose you. This was imposed on me. And again, I think there was a lot, partly because of the speed it was done, but there was I think that bringing people on board sometimes can be forgotten. It's just sort of, we're going to put this scheme together, everyone's enrolled into this scheme, and actually how has that manifested itself in terms of people really understanding what it is they're doing. And I think it's you all know far better than I do. I think one of the problems with pensions is that most people leave it till they're too late in terms of doing something about it. So
100%.
Just because they're in a scheme doesn't mean to say that they can forget about it till they get to 55 and start thinking about drawdown.
Definitely not. You need to make sure you're doing it sooner rather than later. One of the things that I was interested in is that element where you're understanding your client, you're meeting customer needs, but the panacea for most businesses would be to have, you talk about have loyal customers. I like the phrase raving fans. Cassie said she's less keen on that, but having those clients who know you add value, know that you continue to help, and make sure that they're telling their friends and family about you, because as you and I know, a really good client or customer is more likely to stay and talk about you. But I suppose there's elements of that, if you're doing 1 and 2 sort of principle 1 and principle 2 really well and meeting needs, what actions can businesses large and small take to start to think about moving their clients towards, delighting customers and making sure that they turn into I will use it one more time, raving fans?
Well, I think with delighting customers, it's about looking at that whole experience. So it's looking at the customer journey, and we work with organisations in terms of customer journey mapping, which really covers, so what are the key points or what are the key touch points within that journey, from when they first get in touch with you through to being sold or being encouraged to buy a particular product or service, through to actually having delivery of that product or service and going on to then the delivery of it and then the follow-up of it. And it's looking at those, what are those key touch points? Have we actually got the right people doing the right thing at those key touch points? Or actually are some of those key touch points better dealt with by another team or another person? And also looking at those areas in terms of how they can improve. So we might think this is fine, but can actually, if that's a vital part where people are close to an organisation, can we improve that? And a lot of it is actually about continuous improvement, because what's great today and sometimes is only barely adequate tomorrow, because customer experience and people's expectations are rising all the time. And I think we've seen that particularly through the advent of Amazon and some of the delivery firms, where we're coming up to the point of the year where my children think I was around at the dinosaurs time when so I talk about, when I was their age, we had 28 days delivery, and over Christmas we'd have to start thinking about it now, because you had to make sure you ordered it by sort of mid to end of November to make sure you get it on time.
Gotcha.
They've grown up in a world of
next day.
I'll expect it, tomorrow, if not later on this afternoon.
Yeah, you know what's interesting. I'm not a big fan of shopping, so Amazon and firms like it are amazing for me because I can just say to Cass, just add it to your list. And I would just click the button, and actually that's quite a straightforward way of doing it. Less romantic, Tony, but certainly easier.
I quite agree. For somebody who hates shopping and spent many an unpleasant experience when the children were younger and clothes shopping with my wife, I quickly managed to get out of that as soon as I could. But no,
yeah, 100%. And
online shopping is a great benefit, but again, it's around sort of what are those requirements for customers at the time. Some people like the experience of going in.
Yeah.
I think one of the key things that's changed a lot around that experience at the moment is the going in and actually trying clothes on, because now with the COVID regulations, you're not allowed to go and try clothes on, so that's added a lot to even in store of having to do a lot more in terms of returns, and the successful companies are making it much easier to actually make returns. I think that have had to adapt to people almost as part of their business practice of buying sort of 3 or 4 of the same item, whether it's a colour, whether it's a size, to see which one's right for them, knowing they're going to return the other 2 or 3.
And there's new. I mean, in that space, there's new business models popping up all the time, aren't there? There's business models where they'd send you a suitcase of clothes and you just take what you want and send the rest back. And there's interesting things that are happening in that space. Our experience of particularly on behalf of our clients working with larger financial services firms is where often they're really good at the upfront stuff, but in terms of the ongoing and after sales care, working with them can be a bit of a struggle. Do you find that when you're looking at the process, they might be really good at client acquisition and that element, but then sometimes fall down on what they do to make sure that as a client or customer, if I'm talking about them, I'm talking about them in a positive light? That to me happens sort of at the end when I'm experiencing working with them on a more regular basis. What are your thoughts on that?
It's exactly right. I think from the very first business role I had, I think there was always the perception of the salesperson, who quite often in those days was the only customer-facing person, was out there saying anything they needed to get the order and not worrying about the consequences of what then actually happened. And I think organisations have got a lot better now at still sometimes over-promising, but certainly sort of looking at what's that expectation and not over promising to those customers or really sort of building their expectations up too much. I still think there are examples around that, and particularly in some ways we see it with the financial services, where the reality doesn't always hit the expectation. And similarly, one of the in IT as well, in the IT systems, where the promise doesn't always live up to the reality. I think that's there, and I think that's a lot of that is, again, it's bringing that internal and external culture together, so that people within the organisation, we talk a lot about internal customers as well, which is the people helping the people they're working with. So within a business, you might not have a face-to-face contact with a customer, but who are actually your customers in the business? So the accounts team or the distribution team could have their own customers in that business. So again, it comes back to that customer journey mapping, but also the process mapping of how's that all aligning to actually be relevant. And
who do you support in the business, and are they getting the support you need from them? That makes perfect sense. Now, I know you mentioned that you work with a lot of financial services businesses, and in our world, there's been a sort of change in the way that we're regulated. I feel like we're digging in the weeds a bit here, Tony, but it's an important point. It's called SMCR, the change in regulation. How has that impacted the work you're doing, and where can you add real value in terms of those financial services firms that have gone through that change?
I think regulated businesses have a number of things that they have to do, but I think that sometimes customer experience is something they should be doing rather than because it's good for the business, rather than something they do because they're told to do it. I understand why a lot of these regulations are important, but I think if you forget the basics, sometimes they can turn into tick box exercises.
Yeah.
So it's am I actually sort of passing the test? Have I got the processes in place that allow me to do it? I think SMCR is a classic example of that. It was actually designed as part of the Treating Customers Fairly initiatives, making sure that organisations did treat customers fairly and did have the systems in place for accountability and understanding their customers.
Yeah.
I went over a year ago now to a seminar on SMCR, and as the technical or non-financial person there, asked the question in terms of, okay, so how does this impact on what customers are going to receive? And was almost looked at as I was sort of an alien from another planet, because it was very much about focusing on the internal process and saying, well, what do we need to do to satisfy
Tick the box.
The regulator, as opposed to what do we actually need to do to satisfy the needs of the customer?
But I actually think that's backwards, because if you focus on having a good experience and making sure you're doing the right thing for the customer, and ultimately that comes to the values that drive your business, then a lot of that you need to check, and you need to make sure you're doing due diligence and making sure you're ticking those boxes. But your culture drives what happens in the business, and then a lot of those boxes will be ticked automatically, right? Because you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. Regulations aren't there to catch people out or to trick people or to force them to do something that isn't right. Actually, they're there to make sure that most businesses are working in the right way. GDPR was another one, which was across all areas that people got very scared about. But actually, it wasn't really doing anything that you shouldn't be doing anyway in terms of being responsible for customer data and looking after them, and looking after not just customers' data, but employee data as well. So again, I think those regulations are they're well-meaning and they're well-intentioned, and actually very rarely are they doing something that most organisations shouldn't be doing in the first place. Yeah,
100%. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I've got my pen and paper at the ready for my next question, because I'm thinking that we at Cervello want to learn from your experience and see whether we're making one of these three big mistakes. But what are the three most common mistakes you find companies make when they're thinking about their sort of clients that have a negative impact on client experience?
I think the first one is making assumptions, thinking they know what customers want, and where they do get some feedback. There's still a lot of companies don't ask for feedback. What they do, they quite often do it internally, and then it becomes a little bit sort of marking your own homework in terms of looking at those findings and saying, well, actually, or they would say that, wouldn't they? We audit some companies, some organisations who've got a lot of customer data or employee data. We can audit that as opposed to actually go out and ask the same people the same questions again. And quite often it's that sort of that independent view or that comparison view to other organisations, and say, well, actually, let's shine a bit of a light on this business, because you look at something, you just make the assumptions, what customers want, and because they don't always complain or don't always feedback, you just carry on blindly thinking that's right.
But this is part of that, and I'll come on to the other two mistakes. But this is part of the challenge that we've faced as a business, because we've gone out and asked for client feedback, and I think having somebody independent do it might give you a different answer, because especially with a sort of small team like ours, clients don't want to come back and go, I don't want to offend you if you're doing something wrong. So how do you get the honest opinion you can use to grow?
Well, it's right. We do, because we like to practice what we preach, we do a regular assessment on ourselves using our methodology, and we put it through an independent consultant.
Okay.
And it's probably one of the scariest things we do, because obviously we're meant to be experts in this, and we don't want to be sort of told we're not delivering a great customer experience ourselves. But it is, some people see it as a threat, and I think that's where the culture of the business comes into it, in terms of continuous improvement.
Yeah,
really grow the business together. Some of the segmentation, and even though we talk about these aren't league tables, where we do segmentation by account manager, so what the customer scores are for each account manager. Quite often people can take it very personally and say, well, actually, you've got to understand, this isn't, you're dealing with the bigger customers or you're dealing with a different part of the business. So the fact that one account manager gets a higher score than another doesn't necessarily make them better. Overall, it's about this particular area around the customer experience. So I think it's taking away some of that threat of asking the question. I think the other key thing is the actually doing something with the results when you get them, and actually understanding what are the priorities. I think that some people can do a customer survey and just get a lot of data, which can either be confusing or they just pick out one or two comments. Or actually, even worse, they pick on the comments from one or two people who would actually know and say, "Oh, that's Jim or that's Jill. I like her. She's really switched on. We'll do what she thinks." And that can be just a sort of anecdotal evidence of one person's view rather than looking at it across the whole spectrum. And I think the other area is that it's around that benchmarking, not necessarily comparing specific numbers. I get a bit cynical about benchmarking, particularly things like Net Promoter, because the methodology can sometimes be different, so the scores aren't always dealing with put together the same way. But it's that independent view of, well, we've seen these low scores, but actually that relevance or that really reflects what other people see. So whilst they still need to be addressed, don't get hung up on about that's a low score, because actually that's what we'd expect from your type of firm. Or conversely, actually, you're doing really well here. This is some really benefits. These are scores which are much higher than we'd see for other areas.
Yeah, just out of interest, on that net promoter element, do you find certain sectors just naturally have a higher net promoter score than others?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the concept of net promoter is fantastic. I think it's in danger of being slightly overused and also not used properly, because people focus on the score rather than the methodology, which is about closing loops and root cause analysis and trends and all the rest of it. But I think it goes without saying that some people recommend certainly in terms of the core one, and the company that goes on about their high net promoter score all the time is Apple. Yeah. And I suspect that a lot of that is, well, yes, I'm much more happy talking about, showing off about my new Apple Watch or my new iPad or whatever, and talking to people about that than I would be about the bank I use or the financial service that I've just bought. Yeah.
Some sectors are just more glamorous to talk about, aren't they?
Yes, I mean it's changing a little bit now, but at one point the only banking company or banking organisation that had a positive net promoter score was First Direct. Right. Nationwide are now as part of that as well, and one or two others as well. But that, I don't think that was the banking sector in general weren't providing a reasonable customer service. I think it's just the fact that how likely are you to recommend it? And one of the things, and I think it's true, but it amuses me in part, is when we work with IFAs and we ask that question to IFAs, it can be the clues in the name. I'm independent. I recommend what's right at the time, and quite rightly. So they would have in that terms of answer, would also have a sort of a negative impact in terms of recommending, because they would see that impacting on the integrity of the job they do.
Well, I suppose the other thing is as well, I mean, the way that we see it is that we need to probably have a deeper relationship of trust with a client for them to say to their friend, go and have a chat with Chris, than if somebody might say, go and buy the new iPhone. So that barrier in terms of, are you happy to promote? Well, you're talking about somebody's life savings, right? So that might be a bit more important than buying a new shirt or buying a new phone, and that relationship of trust needs to be deeper.
Absolutely correct. And I think we get feedback, and I'd say I'd probably come into this camp as well. I'd be reluctant to recommend a particular investment or a particular product or service, because you never quite know what's going to happen. I'm happy to, so I have done, recommend you as my IFA, because then the onus is on you is to build up that relationship. Yeah. But I see it in some instances, it's a bit like, I'm very reluctant about, I've never sold a car to a friend, because it doesn't matter how good that car is and how, my brother-in-law's a mechanic, so it gets looked after very well. You can guarantee that with my luck, the minute I sold a car to a friend, it would break down the next day, and it would be very embarrassing. And I think that's, again, there's sometimes that becomes impactful in terms
with
of
a big responsibility, doesn't it? Yeah, you're right. So
I think that's why it's vital to not just look at one area, look at the whole methodology and look at the whole sort of lots of different areas. I think again, net promoters taken off because it's quite easy to use and it's short, and so there's only technically there's only one question, but you need to do 2 or 3 to get a little bit further. But it becomes a short, sharp way of finding out, but it doesn't always give you that deeper dive and that sort of extensive knowledge of what's going on with customers. So again, it's right at certain times, but it's not always right.
Yeah, it's translating that into a bit more of a nuanced point of view, doesn't it? But I suppose the other thing, as you said, is doing the work, but then taking the action within the business off the back of that work to make sure that you make change, because otherwise you're just getting the data and doing nothing with it. Just talk to me a little bit about a story that best encapsulates the work you do, and how a business has improved their client experience through working with you.
So if we come back to the difference between loyalty and retention, one of the few arguments I've actually had at a client's boardroom was with an IT company who part of what they did was payroll services, and we reported there that their loyalty score was quite low.
Okay.
And the chairman was adamant that because they'd had customers, or most of their customers have been with them for years, then by definition their loyalty must be incredibly high. And I'd say it's an argument, it got a little bit heated at times, but it was very much a sort of saying, well, actually, these are some of the areas and these are some of the things that the customers say. What I actually did to partly prove a point was to then volunteer to go and personally interview 10 of their clients to see what they actually said, and without exception, every single one of them said we would get rid of this system tomorrow if we could do, with the complication and the challenge of getting rid of a payroll system, which is linked into some of the other systems as well. Yeah. It's just horrendous. It's
the hassle factor that's keeping them there, not the fact they're happy.
Yeah, and actually a couple of them also said, well, I wasn't responsible for doing this in the first place, and I'm not prepared to actually change it, because if we change it and it's no better, then they're going to all point the finger at me, whereas at the moment I can get away with it because I didn't choose it in the first place. And which is a negative way of doing it. It's a bit like saying, well, I've got an employee who's not performing, but I better keep them on rather than sort of help train them, or because I don't sort of have the hassle of doing that. So as I say, but we went back and sort of fed these findings back, and they took some of those on board. So through a couple of the areas they looked at, so one is it was actually training the technical teams in what are the implications, because a lot of the IT focus was around it's a system error or technical glitch, not really understanding what the implications of that meant. So in a large, or even in a small organisation, if the payroll went wrong at the end of the month when people were expecting to be paid, that can have huge implications across the workforce and across the whole company if they can't get the payout on time or the pay's inaccurate. So it was really sort of going back to basics and saying, well, it's not about a system; it's about what does that system do, and really put in, to use that hackneyed expression, put in the technical team in the shoes of the customer to understand what that was about. Yeah. But they also started to do more visits to customers, so going out and equipping them with because some of the workarounds that customers were doing were quite easy to fix. So and often what they were finding from that was that people weren't going back and raising a technical query. There were some issues around the fact that they thought they had to pay for everything, so it's a little bit sort of, okay, I bought this, but now if I want to change anything, I've got to pay more for it. So we'll find a workaround. We're going around and helping them to actually look at those and doing some of the on-the-spot fixes there. And then the other one, when it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about over-promising, was getting the sales team and the technical team to work much closely together. Yeah. Because what they found was that quite often it was the sales team would be over-promising and the technical team couldn't actually
deliver on the promises. Yeah,
so it was from the location point of view, quite often it was the salespeople who were based quite near to the office would come in and start sort of haranguing the technical team to get it right for their customers, and because they were there, the technical team would then give those customers priority. So it always became customers it wasn't so much about, we differentiated between customers who were deemed to be important, but often it was which of the salespeople or which of the customers were shouting loudest got the priority.
And I suppose as well, the new clients are then getting the priority, and the older clients who are more established, who the salespeople aren't speaking to, then get forgotten about, even though they're the ones that are the most loyal.
Absolutely, and that again, it comes back to that difference between loyalty and retention. Is they've been with us for years, they're not going anywhere, so we can leave them for the time being. And actually, I think one of the key things, and we all have organisations where we've got a number of different customers, actually being able to provide a consistent service. It doesn't have to be the same service, but a consistent service across the board, and being seen to give time, genuine time to customers large and small, new or old, is vital. And it's quite often about the language you use and the way you treat people, rather than and making people feel as if they value or if they're valued.
Well, I think for a lot of businesses, the businesses that we look at that get it right are the ones that are really effective at communication, at making sure that we know what they're doing, and even if there are changes, just being better at managing the relationship. So I've got about 3 more questions, but I'm going to have to skip it because we've been talking for ages, Tony. It's been amazing. So let our audience know where they can find out a little bit more about you and about Investor and Customers.
Okay, so the starting point for most organisations is investorandcustomers.com. It's our website. But I think because of the nature of the business we're in, that only tells part of the story. You can also look at the LinkedIn profile areas. But what I'd like to offer is a free consultation with any of the listeners who felt they wanted to just discuss, no obligation, but just wanted to have a discussion about customer experience and any questions they've got about their own business or about their own sector. Then I'm more than happy to spend half an hour or more with any one of those listeners in terms of what we can do to help them, but also it could be that the answer is not at the moment. They might have 1 or 2 questions that they might just have about, or they might have some customer data and say, well, we've got these types of scores. What does that actually mean? What do you think? Do you think we're doing well or badly? So I think the key thing, as we say in our business, is the most important thing to do is ask. So get that personal contact. Don't just look at the website, although that gives some tips, and some of the work we're doing on LinkedIn, we're putting more thought leadership in place in terms of explaining some of these areas. But a conversation is the best place to start.
Yeah, the articles on LinkedIn at the minute are really good. So I'd recommend that anybody watching definitely connect with Tony on LinkedIn and just make sure you're reading some of those articles. Thank you so much for your time today, Tony. I really appreciate it.